Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today I'm going to address a topic which seems to create a lot of confusion for pianists as they are developing their musical interpretations. The performance tradition today on the piano is one where the majority of students are taught to perform Bach metronomically, but there is never an explanation why. Furthermore, there are transitions in Bach's music which, when played in strict time, do not seem to make much sense musically. This is going to be the first video where I discuss temporal vectors of interpretation in Bach, and today we'll focus on ritardandos, where they can be used and how they can be implemented. In Bach's keyboard music, the majority of pieces are built on a regular rhythmic pattern. We see this in dance movements, we see this in fugues, and we see this in preludes or other small pieces. The exception to this comes in the form of the toccatas, but we'll touch on that in another episode. Let's look at a Bach suite. The B minor French Overture is rather traditional in terms of basic structure, but somewhat unconventional in terms of its content. The Overture starts out like this. Then there is a middle fugue in a different time signature, but still rhythmically regular. And then a return to the overture material. Each dance that is represented afterwards is also rhythmically regular throughout, just like in the overture. The music only stops between movements. As an example, the courante starts like this. And keeps going until the end. Same tempo, same rhythm. Some movements are more rhythmically strict than others. The gigue, for example, sets up a rhythmic pattern which is more blatant or obvious to the listener. Again, this rhythm stays until the end. Bach's keyboard works are, for the most part, pure abstract counterpoint. This is not to say that they are heartless or emotionless works, but they function and communicate directly through counterpoint and harmonic manipulation. Almost every single keyboard work of Bach's has a steady tempo with no written fluctuations, as well as repeated patterns of articulation, and in rare cases, dynamic boxes or sections that are rather predictable. Essentially, his form of expression is dependent solely on harmony and counterpoint, and the rest, like rhythmic patterns and tempi, serve as the unchanging framework upon which this expression is mounted. Once you start the motor of the music, You don't turn it off until the music ends. This leads to a natural conclusion for pianists, and their teachers of course. If the rhythm or tempo is written as an unchanging pattern or framework for the more important harmony and counterpoint, then one could assume that this framework should be shunted into the background, to serve as a regular foundation that is predictable and therefore uninteresting. We see the same in most pop music today, where the rhythm is set at the beginning of a song and it doesn't change until the end. Given how humans are not naturally gifted at playing in a strict, regular tempo, it therefore makes sense to train students to play Bach metronomically. There's no reason not to. If I play the fugue section of the overture metronomically, it won't necessarily sound like it's emotionless or mechanical. I can play the bourrée, rhythmically strict, by the book so to speak, and the character and expression of the piece might actually increase in effectiveness. There are clear benefits to having an unchanging tempo in Bach, but this all grinds to a halt when Bach gives us something which cannot function unless the tempo is changed or altered. This is when students ask me, what am I supposed to do with this? It just sounds wrong. When it comes to the temporal vector of interpretation in Bach, we deal with ritardando and rubato. Ritardando is far more common, and it is fairly easy to define where and how to use it. Rubato, on the other hand, is far more difficult to explain, even though from a fundamental standpoint it actually relies upon the same rules that the use of ritardando relies upon. Both of these temporal issues are tied directly to the harmonic structure of the piece, so looking for structural landmarks dividing sections and even phrases becomes very important when you're learning these works. For now, we'll talk only about the use of ritardando, and leave the discussion of rubato in Bach for another episode. Ending pieces in Bach can be rather difficult. He never gives you an indication of ritardando, and if played in strict time, the ends of his pieces can occasionally not sound like an end at all, but just an interruption with something missing afterwards. This is directly caused by our perception of the rhythmic regularity which underpins his pieces. If the motor is suddenly turned off, we wonder why. Here's a great example. So it always helps for us to perceive the motor slowing down, because then it gives us the impression that the motor has the capability of stopping. As a general rule, we have to employ ritardandos at the end of things in Bach. Usually they can be employed at the absolute ends of pieces. If the piece is a fast piece, then the ritardando may only last for a few notes at the end, like this. These are not large changes at all. In many ways, they tend to serve as an emphasis for the final note, which is usually the first note of a following bar. When it's a slow movement, however, things get a little more complicated. If the movement is in 3, you'll likely take the last beat of the bar and slow it down to end on the next bar, like this. If it's in 4, 2, or cut time, you'll most likely take the last 2 major beats in the bar and slow them down progressively. Very often, this happens with the help of a trill, like this. Ritardandos do not only occur at the ends of pieces. There are occasions where Bach sections off a piece so that you have a different character or dance sandwiched between similar sounding opening and closing sections. In our French overture, this is the case. We have a slow overture, a faster fugue, and then back to a slow overture again, written as a continuous entity. When played as written, the transitions can sound rather odd, and this is the point where the confusion of students begins to set in. Before we get to this transition issue, however, I need to address a rhythmic problem which creeps up, not only in Bach, but also in other composers. Consider this a momentary aside. Sometimes composers will change their time signatures at the beginning of new sections, and this immediately brings up the question of rhythmic or tempo equivalence. The opening here is written in cut time, so we're thinking in 2 to a bar. The fugue is written in 6/8 time, which in Bach is traditionally a faster tempo, felt at 2 to a bar as well. If we played it with strict tempo equivalence, we'd have a bit of a problem. On the one hand, if we played the overture slowly enough for it to be sonically clean on the piano like this, then we'd have a fugue that is slow enough to be considered clinically dead. On the other hand, if we played the fugue at a reasonable 6/8 time, given the material like this, then, with a tempo equivalence, the overture would be so fast as to be rendered incomprehensible on the piano. The closest equivalence that can be made would be to have the 6/8 time correlate to the beats of a common time overture rather than a cut time. So the overture can be like this. And the fugue can be like this. There are arguments both for and against tempo equivalence in general, but I've always found that there are no hard and fast rules about it, specifically because individual cases seem to always merit individual solutions. But this kind of decision is necessary because it directly affects how we transition between the two tempi, and thus the two sections. No matter what you choose to do with tempo equivalence or lack thereof, you're still faced with a problem at the beginning, of a slow piece transitioning to a fast piece, and later on reversing course back to a slow character. Frequently in Bach, you'll find what I call hard transitions. A phrase will end in one tempo, and a new phrase will begin in a new tempo, without any pitch transition in between. For example, the overture ends like this. And the fugue begins like this. If I were to play it metronomically, the two would flow into each other in a rather crude way. What Bach forces us to do is to take time between the two sections, even taking the opportunity to signal to the audience using a ritardando that the opening section is coming to a close. We can end the opening section with a ritardando and begin the fugue at an appropriate point after, like this. gives us a similar problem at the end of the fugue. If played metronomically, the transition would sound terrible. Because we are transitioning from a fast section to a slow section, we can now use our ritardando as a break of sorts. I'd call this a standard case of ritardando use between sections of different tempi and character. The sections are clearly delineated, and all we have to do is define to our audience where one section ends and the next begins. The difficulty for students is that in Bach, he doesn't give us any clues as to what to do with these transitions. We have to figure out what works for ourselves. Sometimes, transitions seem to pop out of nowhere, and then things get really interesting. In the A minor English suite, Bach writes a transition in the opening prelude which is unlike anything I've talked about so far. The prelude consists of a nearly constant string of 16th notes, a motor that is always running. Though the piece can be separated into different sections by harmonic content, the rhythmic drive never really stops, not until Bach drives us off a cliff for a moment. The structural problem that exists is really quite simple. Bach is in C major, and he wants to find a way to get back to A minor with an exact recapitulation of the opening material. Instead of doing this as a rhythmic continuum, he breaks the motor and stops everything for seemingly a final cadence. Then he starts the motor again. This sounds fine in theory, but when put into practice, several things start to go wrong. Remember the concept of playing Bach metronomically? Well, this fails miserably at transition points like this, and the problem is exacerbated because there are no explicit instructions that we can count on to tell us what to do. There are no double bar lines, no changes in time signature, and no written indications. In fact, this transition is notated in time, and as a result, an inexperienced student will play it in time. There's no reason not to. This leads to an unfortunate hurried transition, which almost sounds like bad composition. In order for this not to happen, we have to first be in the position to recognize the elements of the transition. Let's start at the end and work backwards. The recapitulation starts just after the first beat of bar 110. This would indicate that the first beat of that bar belongs to the previous cadence material. So, the cadence and the recap material are clear. But what do we do with the other two bars of strange stuff? Well, we have the dead stop, the car crash. And we have the transition to the car crash from the motor. So in total, we have a transition from the motor to a dead stop, then a cadence, and then the recap. If we didn't have the car crash, and only had the cadence, then the natural solution would be to have a small ritardando at the cadence and restart the tempo at the recapitulation, like this. But the crash extends the transition for a longer time, almost like an exclamation point. So instead of this, we actually have this. order to exaggerate this exclamation, we have little choice but to take some time there as well. Taking time means that the cadence will be slightly slower, with a ritardando that seems more extreme in time difference when compared to the opening material. This affects, of course, how we begin the recapitulation. A slower cadence means that we'll have to take a little more time between the resolution of the cadence and the beginning of the recap. In this way, one choice affects the next, and this is why this seemingly innocuous and ugly passage continues to confuse students year in and year out. Metronomic playing in Bach can serve a good purpose, as long as the material is well understood. The last example, dealing with the transition in cadence, serves to remind us what happens when the material is not recognized for what it actually is. But we're still left with the question of why we play Bach metronomically. Why can't we perform Bach with the same temporal freedom we employ in Chopin or Debussy, for instance? If the music is abstract, shouldn't it survive temporal stretching? Finally, performers who use historical instruments like harpsichords, clavichords, or organs all seem to employ heavy bouts of rubato in their playing. Isn't that evidence enough that we should do so as well on the modern piano? These are questions which are best left to another episode of Ask a Pianist, wherein I shall discuss the use of rubato in Bach. For now, keep practicing, and if the motor is running, don't mess with it, except at cadences and transitions. Bye for now.